Hello and welcome to Ransomware Recovery in 2022. Today's webinar is sponsored by Veeam and produced by Actual Tech Media. My name is Scott Becker. I'm from Actual Tech Media and I'm delighted to be here as your moderator for this special event. Now, before we get to today's great content, we do have a few housekeeping items that will help you get the most out of this session. First off, we want this to be an informative event for you, so we encourage any questions in the questions box in our webinar control panel. Not only will we have team members responding to your questions during the live event, but we've got a couple of speakers today who are fast on their feet and will be monitoring and answering your questions all through the presentation. So enter your questions early and often. That Q&A panel is also the place to let us know about any technical issues you might be experiencing. A browser refresh is going to fix most audio, video, or slide advancement problems, but if that doesn't work, just let us know there in the Q&A and we'll provide further technical assistance. Now, in the handout section of your webinar control panel, you'll also find that we're offering several resources. There are two great handouts from Veeam that I especially want to call your attention to. One is the 2022 Ransomware Trends Report. This is a great report, and all of the data that you're going to see in the slides is sourced from that report. So if you want the data that you're seeing here today, just grab that report. Also in the handout section is a white paper from Veeam called Ransomware Building Secure Backup as Your Last Line of Defense. As always, you can find in your handouts as well links to the Gorilla Guide Book Club, where you can get access to Actual Tech Media's great printed resources on technology topics, and to the ATM Event Center, which has our calendar of upcoming events. So I encourage you to access those resources now and share them with your friends and your colleagues. Now, at the end of this webinar event, we will be awarding a $300 Amazon gift card to one lucky registrant. Of course, you must be in attendance during the live event to qualify for the prize. The official terms and conditions of today's prize drawing can be found in the handout section as well. Just scroll to the bottom and you'll find the prize terms and conditions link there. Finally, one of the best benefits of this event is the opportunity to ask a question of our expert presenters. So to help encourage your questions, we have a special additional prize for you. That's another Amazon gift card, this one for $50, for the very best question. So at the end of the event, we'll look at all the questions that came in, pick out the very best one, and contact that prize winner afterward. And with that, let's get to today's fantastic content. So it's my pleasure to introduce you to our presenters today. We have Chris Hoff, who's Data Protection and Ransomware Marketing Manager at Veeam. And we have Jason Buffington, who is Vice President for Market Strategy in the Office of the CTO at Veeam, also known as the Data Protection Dude. So Chris, Jason, welcome, gentlemen. It's great to have you here.
Thanks, Scott.
So Jason, I'm going to turn things over to you and looking forward to what you have to say.
Oh, thanks. Yeah, so as Scott mentioned, all the data that we're going to share during the report today comes out of a research report, which was published just a few months ago, back in May. The URL for that report, actually, if you want follow-up materials on it, can actually be found on that front slide as well, vee.am/RW22. And I believe the report is actually already provided to you in the download materials for today's event. So let's start the conversation actually not with ransomware. Let's talk about all the other kinds of disasters that still plague IT in 2022. I've been in the data protection space for about 32 years. For about 9 of those, I was a certified business continuity planner. And when you look at traditional DR, right, at least from an IT perspective, and that can include everything from hardware failures to fire, flood, earthquake, whatever the crisis du jour is that we've always been protecting IT for, there's kind of 3 macro steps that always are part of almost any DR plan. So certainly first, can you recover each and every workload, right? So that's that first meta point. And so do you have reliable copies to recover from? And then how are you going to achieve that? The second phase that happens is typically when we talk about a disaster, for most organizations, you're going to think about it in terms of massive scale. It's not just a server that went down. Maybe it was a rack that went down. More likely, it was a site that was encumbered. And so the second question is, how do you shrink the time to recover each and every workload? Because now you're going to have to do all the workloads, or at least a good portion of them, at scale. And then third, recognize that if you're dealing with flood, your primary data center is underwater, so you have to go to a second site. If you're a flood, your servers are crispy. Earthquake, They're now have dirt inside them. Whatever the scenario is, you're going to be recovering to an alternate set of infrastructure. And if a server went down in Dallas, Texas, and then woke up in Boston, how do you make sure those users can actually connect? Or maybe it didn't wake up in Boston, it woke up in a cloud, right? So those are the three questions that are part of the recipe of any IT disaster recovery methodology is, can I get the workloads up, many of them at scale, presumably to alternate infrastructure? That's a regular disaster. When we add ransomware into the equation, all of a sudden some of the rules have a little bit of variation along the way. And we're going to talk about those variations in a second, but there is no one better suited to talk about how do we add ransomware to a DR conversation than the person that Veeam added when we wanted to make sure that we had the ransomware story right. That's my good friend, Chris Hoff. Chris, thanks for joining us today.
Yeah, it's great to be here. It's kind words, my friend.
Okay, so Chris, this is a regular disaster, right? And what all of these disasters have in common for as long as I've been doing this is the copy that was running on the production servers milliseconds before the bad thing happened, the fire, the flood, the earthquake, or whatever. My job in life was to make sure, how do I get that copy from moments ago spinning as quickly as possible so the users can get up and running again? That's exactly not the copy we want in a ransomware scenario. Is that fair?
That's fair, because the ransomware, depending on whose study you look at for dwell time, you're looking at anywhere from weeks to months that the bad actor has been in your environment. And so you could have data that's been corrupted a millisecond ago, or that has been corrupted 3 months, 6 months ago.
So if we talk about the fact that ransomware is a disaster, the mitigations, remediations, and the preparations for ransomware recovery should be part of a holistic DR strategy. But when you look at this plan on the left, it's kind of incomplete, recognizing that that last known copy is not your best copy. So let's move that around a little bit. And so here's let's call it the detour that happens, right? You're still going to want to prep to make sure that the workloads are recoverable. You're still going to want to think about scale. You're eventually going to think about alternate infrastructure. But in between there's a couple other questions that you have to come up with, such as how much data has been affected? Do you have survivable repositories? And then also, can you introduce data safely back in the environment again? Now, I think about it from the top line view, but Chris, Veeam has a different perspective on really the same 6 characteristics.
We do, and the reality is that the bad actors look at their attacks from an ROI perspective, right? How do I get the most money out of my victim that I possibly can? Mm-hmm. And ransomware has, in fact, democratized data theft. Because no longer can you say that I'm too small or I don't have anything of value to the bad guys, right? It just needs to be valuable to you in order for you to pay money to get it back.
Sure.
And the challenge is that we make too many assumptions when we're looking at our data protection plans. When it comes to ransomware, we assume that we're going to be able to just restore from backup, and in technology there is no such thing as just, right? It's never that easy. So we need to make sure that we've got visibility into the data so that we can find out where I'll call it the corruption is. We need to make sure that the data in the backup itself hasn't been tampered with, and we'll get into this that the backups are now a target for the bad actors, and we need to make sure that we can restore in the amount of time that the business can survive on. A lot of organizations pay the ransom because it's viewed as being faster than the restore process, and that's just not something that's acceptable to us at Veeam.
Well, not only that, but it's statistically not true. It's not. We watch the Hollywood movies where they talk about, something's been locked out, and then you pay the Bitcoin or whatever, and someone waves a magic wand, and okay, we're all better again. It's really not how it works, right?
No, and
So,
there is nobody sitting with their hoodie and there's no blinking lights. It's usually somebody who is saying, "Oh, hey, IT guys, my laptop is acting funny,"
right,
and
right.
that's how the investigation starts.
So let's actually dig into that. So Chris, you come from a deep security background. I come from a traditional backup and DR perspective. So one of the things that we wanted to do to make sure we really have the best possible data is there was a survey done, and this is the survey we talked about at the beginning of the call. So let me kind of paint a picture for actually. Already got our first question in. So who's in the survey? So we talked about that at the beginning of the thing. So there were 1,000 organizations that were surveyed, all of which had at least one successful cyber attack in 2021. Now, successful cyber attack, I guess. So the bad guy was successful, and you can judge for yourself how successful the organization was in remediating from it. But 1,000 organizations from 9 different countries around the world, organizations of all sizes, by the way. Chris, one of the things that that always struck me, one of the things I first learned from you, in fact, was when we talk about democratizing theft. I just keep thinking of those old style fishermen that throw out that big net into the water, and then looking at what happens. They don't throw the net out and say, "I'm only fishing for big fish today," or small fish. They just throw the net out, right? And then whatever comes back, and whether it's a snack or a full meal is based on what they catch, but it's a wide net that gets thrown along the way. Anyway, so let's talk through. If you look in the upper right-hand corner, we had broken this down into kind of 6 elements to think about when we think about ransomware recovery. And the first one is, can you actually recover a given workload? And again, I would tell you that this is not just a ransomware question, right? This is the same question whether or not you have storage failure on a server, whether or not you have a bad patch, because hey, it's Tuesday and patches usually go bad on Tuesdays, right? We know this to be true. It's been 6 years at Microsoft. You're welcome, and I'm sorry, just in that order. Servers fail for all kinds of reasons, but one of them is because all the data got encrypted. And so one of the questions that came out of the survey was, how do you ensure that the backups are recoverable? And Chris, let's talk about the data that's on the side here, because I'm going to paint out a few things. As the backup dude, as the data protection guy, I'm just going to point out 60% of organizations said they're checking the logs, right? I'm going to just go ahead and tell you, in a lot of surveys, there's, it's about opinion and there's no wrong answer. That's a wrong answer, right? If the only thing you're doing is checking the log, then what the log has said is the job completed successfully, the tape didn't crap out, VSS did not provide an error, I didn't miss connectivity, right? That is not the same thing as, can I actually recover a workload? The one that's right next to it actually isn't that much different. I tested readability on the media. If you too are still in 1995, right, when tapes were really, really crappy, and you wanted to make sure the tape was good, you would write to the tape and then you would read from the tape. But in 2022, where the rest of us live, you have a higher likelihood of bit rot or data corruption on a running spindle on a drive than you do an LTO tape cartridge. So it's not about readability, right? Really, in this question, 16% said, I automate VM or system level restores to test the application. So I put it in a sandbox, I spin it back up. What I just backed up, I recover that into a test box. Can I do a file exist? Can I ping it? Can I do a MAPI query? Can I do an ODBC? Does the application actually spin up in that box? I'm going to say on this survey question, I believe only 16% got it right. Chris, that means 84% got it wrong.
Yes, they did. You kind of hit the nail on the head. And by the way, we're getting a ton of questions in, and so if you see me dancing around here, I'm looking at the questions, and a lot of them that have come in, we're gonna be answering as we go. So we're not ignoring them, but the fact that we're looking at the test as being the job starting or finishing or not is, to your point, just telling us that the job finished. It doesn't mean that the data that you need is actually there. And the problem that I see and have experienced it myself is it's great that there's organizations that are rolling their own tests and they're building their own automation. But in my experience, once the person who wrote the script or built the manual process leaves the company, that process tends to fall apart. Right, the script doesn't get updated. The process is too mundane. Nobody wants to do it, so it just kind of gets ignored. Having all of that built in is critical these days, because you want to make sure that the data's there. And more organizations, when they're doing tabletop exercises for cyber attacks, are pulling in the backup people and asking that it be proved that the data is recoverable.
Now that actually leans into one of the 6 tenets as part of Veeam's narrative on this. Before you kind of double into how that works, though, I also point out, so I was listening to a call the other day with a customer who was doing a debrief after having been attacked with ransomware. And one of the things I was surprised to hear is that the bad actor had actually gone in and found a way into the backup system. This was not a Veeam environment. They'd gone into the backup system and simply removed some of the jobs or some of the workloads to be protected from the job. So the job was still showing that it's successfully completed. It just wasn't actually protecting any of the backup servers. I think all that was left was protecting one token laptop. So the job would still fire and show green every single day. So if the only thing you were doing was a log, then yeah, it was green. Hey, that one laptop, you are good to go. All the servers, not so much. Yep. Right. So so it's amazing some of the intricacies and in depth those bad actors are going to. Okay, so we talk about assuring the workload conceptually. What's the Veeam answer to that mission imperative?
Well, so we've built the verification process into the product, and whether we call it sure backup or backup verification, right? Product name versus capability name type of thing. The idea is that we want to make sure that the data that you think you're backing up is actually there. To your point, and to the victim's point, they want to make sure that the job hasn't been tampered with, and make sure that the right people are making changes. And all of that goes into making sure that the data is going to be there when you need it. I mean, the best comment that I ever heard was the worst time that you want to hear somebody say "I think" is in the middle, or "I don't know" is in the middle of a crisis.
I like that one. Hey, by the way, we've got some great comments coming in already. So Khan Hollis asks, does Veeam have the capability to recognize something is occurring not good, like files encrypted, and send out emergency notification? Yes, actually in Veeam 1. So if you presume, so for example, that normally you have a backup churn rate of say X%, 2, 3, 4% daily change rate, and all of a sudden the next day you haven't really done anything new, but you got a 60% backup rate on deltas going into your server, that's a good flag. Now, Chris, let's be clear. This doesn't replace the proactive monitoring and detection technologies that the cyber team is part of, but absolutely, if it missed that first gate, we want to be part of that notification awareness system as well as remediation.
Absolutely, and you're right. We're not replacing your detection capabilities, right? But what we're seeing more and more in the security space is that companies are moving from detection based, right, the AV style detection, to more of a response process, right? So on the endpoint and in the malware world, people are talking about EDR, endpoint detection and response products, and that's looking at malware that has gotten through the gates, is possibly running on the systems and has been discovered after the fact. We have alerts that will tell you that something is something has changed, whether that's an increase in data transfer, increase in backup size, what have you. That delta is the anomaly that we want to look at. And in many cases, just like I said, the most common way to that incidents are discovered is somebody saying my laptop's acting funny.
Yeah.
A lot of organizations are finding that these anomalies that may have been ignored in the past are indicative of a cybercrime. Yeah. And by the way, we're talking about ransomware here. Ransomware being a very specific type of threat, we're still talking about cybercrime in general, right? So whether it's an automated process or somebody's going to actually get eyes on glass, the same thing is going to be true.
Chris, we've got a couple of great questions coming in. First and foremost, I want to say we've got some folks chiming in from where they're from. So I saw New York is in the house. I saw South Carolina is in the house. I got to give a special shout out to Tony from Westlake because I'm in Louisville, just down the road. So anyway, so let us know who you're from, or where you're coming from. So there's some great questions in there we want to make sure we get some time to. So let's accelerate some of the pre-prepared stuff and see where we might get some other things that are coming in as well. I will go ahead and just throw one out there I really like. Nebosha asks about why do legacy backup architectures no match for modern cyber threats, leaving our data vulnerable? I'm going to give a quick answer. Chris, throw in one and we'll go to the next topic. In my bet, one of the biggest problems with, two. One with legacy backup architectures is if your legacy backup architecture is simply using like NAS file shares, back when the main things you were protecting against were things like fire and flood and hurricane, you didn't really worry about the insider affecting the backup repository. Now you do have to affect for that. So making sure that you're actually locking down those repositories is something that you've had to do now that you didn't have to do back when you thought you could trust everyone that was in the building. The second thing that's along those same lines is, as I said, I've been in backup for 32 years, right? And I will tell you, I've spent a large part of my career taking out one backup solution and putting the next one in. You know, one thing that almost every data center almost always does, they leave the service credential accounts the same over time. Once upon a time, you create a user account in Active Directory called Backup Agent, right? And no matter how many times you swapped out the backup software, you left that credential alone because heck, it's on every single box. Why would you want to change that? The reason you want to change that is because somewhere around the way, they're going to find that out. And now you have a domain level account, which can actually touch all your backup servers and most of your production boxes while they're at it, right? So one of the benefits when you are swapping a backup solution out is take that opportunity to do a security assessment of the data protection architecture. Are my repositories clean? Do I have new access accounts? Have I shut all the old backdoors down? Right? Those kinds of things can really radically change it. If you don't, then legacy backup is going to seem more vulnerable because it's been around a while. And so it's a good attack surface. Chris, throw a quick one out and then we got to get to topics 2 through 6.
Yeah, absolutely. So just to build on that, legacy backup doesn't take into account the fact that the bad guys are going after your backup data, both to destroy it and make it unavailable to you, but also so that they can download it themselves. If they know that they can just download your backup repositories and then restore them, then you're giving them an easy way to steal your data.
That's absolutely, yeah. So if you're thinking about egress and not just arson and not just encryption or ransom, that becomes a huge consideration. Good catch. All right, so we talked a little bit about this one already, so maybe this one fast forwards through. But one of the things we talked about early on, Chris, was the idea there's just no magic wand, and there's not like you can just say, okay, I'm going to enter this bit key, and then boop, all my servers are back and going again. One of the questions that was asked in the survey was looking at those 1,000 organizations, again, not being customers. I guess statistically speaking, 14% of them are because that's our global market share, but that means 86% work. All right, but when you ask those organizations, how long did it take from when you started the remediation effort until you were done? Okay, if I'm going to do a back of the napkin, it looks like around just short of 3 weeks-ish. And that's after you just start the remediation. For a lot of organizations, the triage and assessment of how bad is it and how pervasive was the affectation is far more than that. But once you say, okay, it's time to roll up our sleeves, 3 weeks, Chris, really?
And that's a hard down, right? So you're talking about salespeople not being able to sell, not being able to generate revenue, right? But you still have your fixed costs that you're dealing with. You still have to pay employees. Plus, now you have to deal with the crisis itself. So that's that's some real money we're starting to talk about. And there's a lot of organizations out there, big and small, that couldn't survive it. They just don't have the cash on hand.
So let's double down on that, because so when we talk about what's the answer to that, I'm gonna go off script for just a second. When we talk about how do you shrink the time for remediation, so anyone who's ever been on a webcast with me before knows that I do a lot of work with scouts, a lot of camping, a lot of hiking. One of the things that we do, and we teach that first aid merit badge that every scout has to learn, is how do you shrink the time between snake bite and hospital, right? How do you shrink that time? Because that's going to affect your ability to live. In this case, when the question is, how do you shrink the time from I want to start recovering a server to when it's back online again, I'm just going to point out humans are not good at repetitive, detailed tasks like, okay, I'm going to mount this storage, and I'm going to go and mount these, change these IP addresses over, and I'm going to bring the server up. Those kinds of minutia tasks, how do I squeeze that time down? I'm going to tell you, in my mind, the only way it works is orchestration. Now, in this case, this actually comes from a different survey. This actually comes from the Data Protection Trends Survey, the largest survey of its kind, 3,400 organizations from 28 countries around the world. URLs in the very lower left-hand corner on the bottom, vee.am/DPR22. Maybe we can try to also get that added to the downloadable assets or in the follow-up link that happens at the end of the webcast. But one way or the other, one of the questions was asked is, what kinds of failover mechanisms, the orchestration, the engine to get you back up and running again do you have? 29%, Chris, said, oh, we're just going to manually reconfigure it because we know stuff and we're guaranteed to be there when the bad things happen. So I'm just going to assume that's wrong. There's 45% that said, hey, we got a script. Right? The day after we launched this product or this application or this server, we wrote a script so you could refire it up again anytime you wanted to. And thankfully, the production environment never changes, never matures or evolves. So I'm sure that script is just as good as the day one when you first rolled it out. And then there's 25% of folks who actually got it right, who are actually doing orchestrated workflows. Now, we do actually have a question in here on routinely testing by restoring, and give credit to Paul on this one. I know it isn't as good to do routine testing by restoring, but how much do the health checks detect issues like this? I'm going to say now the health check always ensures the validity of the repositories. The Veeam One monitoring tool actually does a better job of notifying you that something is errant from the data perspective. Between the two, I think you get much better flow. But because your question already is talking about Veeam, I'm just going to assume you're already running Veeam backup and recovery or replication or primary flagship. If you're running VBR, please everyone listen to this. If you're running VBR and you're not taking advantage of Disaster Recovery Orchestrator, or just Orchestrator for short, that's what's going to give you all those workflows to accelerate the VBR that you're already protecting. So really be thinking of that as just, it's an accelerant to the VBR that you're already relying on, strictly for scenarios like this. Chris, is that fair from this perspective? And how do we make this applicable for when ransomware is part of the problem?
So that's fair. And when we're talking about ransomware, I'm going to just keep harping on the need to restore and being able to automate the testing so that you can get that, I'll call it the one-click restore, is what's really going to make sure that the data is there. And as a matter of fact, questions are flying by. You guys are asking a lot of great questions, trying to keep up here. There was a question in here about actually protecting the workloads themselves, and we're going to get into it a little bit more in a bit, but having this type of automation, making sure that you can that what's going to happen, and that you're able to update the processes themselves as things change, as you patch, as you grow or shrink or whatever else is going on, means that you're going to be able to survive the attack. As a matter of fact, somebody in here, I think it's now on page 3, asked about the scalability, and really the beauty of Veeam is because we're software based, we're not locked into hardware appliances, means that you can scale almost infinitely. You never want to say infinitely, just with adding licenses and adding storage.
So one thing that I will point out, so the feature that we call it is instant recovery at scale. There is a little secret to how this works and the reason that it works the way that it does. If you think about it this way, when you take steak and you put it into a meat grinder, it turns into hamburger. And so it's much more malleable. You can do more with it. It's easier to store, blah, blah, blah. But if you really wanted steak, you got to put it right back through that meat grinder and actually magically have it come out the other side. When you think about how traditional backup works, traditional backup is basically like taking production steak and turning it into a backup set of goo that we can call hamburger, right? That's actually not how Veeam retains that data. Yes, we do some compression. Yes, we leverage whatever deduplication and whatever storage solutions that you're already using, soft or hard. But steak still looks like steak when we store it. It's smaller, but it's still more like freeze-dried. The point of that analogy is that's what makes instant recovery, our feature, possible, is because we can actually just wake it right back up again. We don't have to rehydrate. We don't have to take it back through the meat grinder and pull it back from hamburger and steak. Because of how we store the data, we can do basically an instant mount. So we can actually mount it from within the backup repository. We don't have to run it through the grinder again. That's what gives you that rapid mount. Now, in, say, for example, the VMware environment, you can do that mount and actually bring that VM up while it's in the backup repository and then just vMotion it back into production. But that's kind of part of the trick on shrinking that remediation window, is being able to bring it back up within that secondary instance. Now, we're going to talk about how do we make sure that copy that you just woke up is clean a little bit later in the deck, but that's how instant works. Is yes, I can mount it immediately, like microwaving something that's been frozen. And oh, by the way, I can then shrink all the other steps necessary to get you to that point by doing that orchestration. So those are the two Veeam elements that kind of come into play. All right, Chris, let's talk about 3 out of 6. So you talked earlier about pervasiveness. In fact, we got a couple questions. James asks, what features can quickly determine scope? There's of the breach. There's another one down here earlier on how do I figure out how wide the breach is? One thing to recognize, and this comes back from the ransomware data, is when we looked at, okay, how do they get in? Because certainly that's going to affect their opportunity for scale and breach. The first thing is, Chris, it amazes me that in 2022, with all the hype, with all the media on ransomware, that the top answer on how they first got into the environment is still somebody clicking on a link. And then, of course, once they get in, let's talk about what happens on the right-hand side. But does the data on the left surprise you? And then, oh, by the way, why don't you break down what we're talking about on the right-hand side?
Yeah, no, not at all. 80-something% of email, depending on the study that you look at, is spam, right? And that's on the internet. So it's cheap, it's prolific, it's easy. So of course it's going to be the thing that the bad actors are going to use. The only thing that it takes is somebody being distracted enough to click on that email. As a matter of fact, I've got a great one that I've saved in one of my junk accounts that looks like it's from Amazon. It's really good. And the only thing that's different is that the link that you click on doesn't go to Amazon. It goes to the malware site. So it is not surprising at all that email and phishing is still the top concern. Now,
not easy. Remember, it's effective. If it wasn't effective, they wouldn't keep doing it. Okay, absolutely. So now they're in, right? They've somehow gotten compromised credentials. You click that silly link, all the magic happens. They are now in. To me, the right-hand side of this is just downright scary.
Well, it's showing the adaptability of the bad actors, and again, this is not some guy in his basement in a hoodie. This is legitimate, call it a corporation, organization that is building this malware. They're testing it, and they're doing the research that they need to figure out what systems are vulnerable. Right. Last week there was an article. VMware pushed out a bunch of patches for some pretty critical vulnerabilities. Right. Which, by the way, should dispel the whole Linux is safer than Windows mantra. But they're going after the places where the data lives, and that is your Office 365 environment. That's going after your cloud environments. They're going after the places where they know they can get the biggest bang for their bucks. So none of that information on the right hand side is particularly surprising to me. As a matter of fact, I would say that some of that is a little bit.
Could even be low. Could even be optimistic.
That's the word I was looking for. Optimistic.
There you go. I'm here for you, man. All right, so let's double down on. Okay, so the bad actors are someone clicked on a bad link. We now know they're taking advantage of vulnerabilities that admittedly admins probably should have been locking down beforehand. So here's perhaps the worst slide in the deck. And I'm going to go ahead and build this out because I think there's two things. And for folks at home, if you don't want to wait to download the report, screenshot when both these charts up, because this should change the conversation that you're having within your constituents. So the first question on the left was, what percentage of the production data do you estimate was successfully encrypted? Right? Bad actor got in, production data across the board, 1,000 organizations surveyed, on average, 47%, just under half. Now, one thing I like about this chart is it shows that there's not like just a couple bad situations that kind of skew the results. In fact, actually, very few organizations actually said they got just about everything. There's a pretty even distribution on that left-hand side of amount of data that was affected overall, but 47%, just under half of the data is encrypted. Here's the bad part. Look on the right-hand side. What percentage of the data was your organization able to recover? Again, not Veeam backups overall, right? We want to make sure that one's clear. But in this case, 69%. So if I'm going to do back of the napkin on this, so of the 47% that went bad, 69% was recoverable, which means 31 wasn't. 31 times 47, you get about 17%-ish. So basically a sixth. 1/6 of the production data was encrypted and didn't come back. And all you got to do is just pick the right sixth, Chris. I mean, if you do, you're good. If you don't, I think the technical term is screwed, is kind of how I'd look at that.
Yep. The way I think of it is, if my data gets corrupted, I'm gonna get the finger wag from IT, and they're gonna give me back what they can give me back. If our CEO's data gets corrupted or his laptop gets attacked, there's probably people running down the hallway. Yeah. And so then with all that, you gotta figure out, what are they going after? And they're probably going after the most valuable data.
So that's going to bring us back into what's the Veeam answer for that, right? So the 32110. Chris, it sounds like a zip code, but I'm guessing it means more than that.
It definitely means more than that. As a matter of fact, I just answered in the Q&A about this. So somebody was asking, what happens if I encrypt my backups and the bad guy re-encrypts those backups? Well, the 321 rule is what's gonna save you in most cases. As a matter of fact, when I joined Veeam a little over a year ago, talking with our support folks, they told me the one thing they wish more customers did was follow this rule. And it is having at least 3 different copies of the data on at least two different types of media, one of which is air gapped or offline, or one of which is immutable, and making sure that you have 0 errors in your backups. All of that together is going to give you the best chance of survival when you're being targeted.
Okay. Yeah, couldn't have said it better myself. So let's go on to the next one. So we talked already about pervasiveness. Now let's start to look into the answer. Now, if I could make a rule, that and technically I guess there is a rule, right? Actually, the government says don't pay. And the reason they say that is because bullies come back to the people that paid. But here's actually an interesting question. The question was, did the organization pay the ransom and recover its data? Now, there's two nuances to this question that I think are really worth exploring. The first one is, let's look at the organizations that did pay the ransom. 1,000 organizations, 52%, they paid and they were able to recover. 24%, so actually right about half of that paid but could not recover the data. So basically you got a 2 out of 3 chance of, if you pay, actually being able to restore. Chris, when you and I first started looking at this data, I was surprised by your response to this around the lack of QA in the decoder. I'd never thought about that before.
Well, the bad guys are looking at encrypting the data and getting the money. They don't really care, quite honestly, about allowing you to have your data back. And so that's where that 24% comes from, right? Is those are the folks who are not getting a fully QA'd tool to decrypt their data. As a matter of fact, there's been instances that the ransomware attacker isn't even keeping the encryption keys that they're using. They're just creating a key and shooting it out there. So they have no way to get your data back for you.
Can you imagine going to the CIO and saying, hey, we did get attacked. It's bad. By the way, if you go and get all those corporate funds and put it into a Bitcoin account someplace, we have a 2 out of 3 chance of getting at least some of our data back. And in my mind, that's what we call a career, a resume generating event is probably the right way to say this. Okay, so 75, but unfortunately, the reality is, looking at this, about 75, 76% of respondents did actually pay, even though a third of them didn't get what they paid for. I'm much more a fan of the 19%, only 1 in 5 organizations that actually said, no, we didn't pay, we just restored. Now, I would love to think that every one of these was a Veeam customer, and that's how they did it. And by the way, that's why this wedge is painted green, right? Veeam green. But the idea being 3 out of 4 organizations paid, not all of which got what they paid for. Meanwhile, 19% of organizations actually, they just restored without along the way. If I were to boil down this entire webinar into one phrase, Veeam's mission is to help the other 81% of cyber victims be able to answer yes, or actually no, we did not pay, we restored instead. That is our mission in life in 2022. Chris, can I get an amen on that?
Amen on that. And we have Pete Donahue over here, who also said that they didn't pay because they don't expect the bad guys to be good on their word. It's a great way to put it.
Yes. Now, when we talk, but if you're going to say, no, I'm not going to pay, the problem with that is that assumes you have a survivable repository out there. And if you don't have a survivable repository, you don't get the choice, right? There's nothing to restore from. Chris, let's talk about, what does it mean to be immutable? How do we ensure that for Veeam customers?
Yeah. So just to set to level set a little bit, immutability is stopping somebody from making changes to the data, right? It's not ensuring that the data that you've put in the repository is clean and free of malware. So the way that we do it is that we take advantage of the immutability tools that are built into your storage devices. Somebody mentioned Nutanix in the chat. They've got a great system, as does HP and others. But making sure that any Amazon, with S3 buckets and all of that, means that you're not going to be able to change that data. It means that the bad guys can't corrupt it further, I guess would be the best way to say it. Doesn't mean that you didn't actually back up the ransomware in the first place. But we'll get to that.
Yep, we'll talk about that in a second. I would just point out, by the way, that you can have immutability or protected repositories throughout the entire life cycle. Now, we don't have the chart in this particular deck, but you can have storage, which has immutable write once, read many options. You can use tape. Ain't nothing more air gappable than taking a tape out of a drive and sticking it on a shelf, right? Cloud, you've given some great examples of repositories there. Is not just a single bullet, is not just a single answer. You can actually have immutable, survivable data at each and every layer of the data lifecycle for where your backup repositories live.
Yep, and that's what we talk about. We talk about having immutability everywhere.
Yep,
and it means that you're going to have, knock on wood, something that you can restore. It might not be everything, but if you're doing it right, you're going to get your most critical data back.
Now, Chris, you bring up a fantastic example of the difference between a repository and the contents of that. I know we've only got about 12 minutes left, and I want to make sure we get a chance to cover some questions, but your anecdote is perfect for this. Can you break it down for us or share with the group?
Yeah, so I carry a water bottle wherever I go. And the water bottle itself is immutable. The bottle is, I can't add anything to it. I can only get stuff out one way, but that doesn't mean that the bottle itself or the contents in the bottle are clean. It doesn't mean that this is water. It could be gasoline. It could be bourbon for the backup, for the data guys. Immutability means that I can't get in here, but the verification, making sure that the data is clean, is something that we need to do as well. And that's another piece that we here at Veeam take very seriously, and we want to automate.
And in fact, I can mention we have like 4 or 5 different questions around that kind of topic, around how do you reintroduce clean data through the Q&A. So here's how the question read in the survey instrument. How did the organization, again, looking at those 1,000 organizations, how did they ensure the data was clean prior to restoration? And I'm going to go ahead and say, in my mind, there's only one correct answer on this. It's the lime green wedge on that right-hand side, 46%, which I love, right? About half. We first restored to I'm reading it off the chart, to an isolated test area or, quote, sandbox, close quote, before scanning back into production. I think everything else around, hey, we restored it back on the production servers and then scanned it really fast, right? Well, if your scanner worked the first time, you wouldn't be in this mess. So I love the fact that you're actually able to drop this into what's essentially a quarantine staging area. We actually call it staged restore. And you can run whatever scanners are out there. By the way, if you happen to be a Veeam partner or a Veeam service provider, this is also a fantastic way to add value to your customers and subscribers, because that way you can supplement whatever mediocre scanning technologies they were using in production, and you can integrate scanning technologies during our backup stream as well as during our staged restore to actually have 2 different ways to detect that data in or out of a part of that data lifecycle. So, Chris, I love the 46%. I just wish we could get it to be more than half.
I love it too, but remember that these aren't all Veeam customers. We don't know how many were, and a lot of these people, similar to where we started, are rolling their own. So they're probably, if I'm going to make some assumptions, they're probably restoring into maybe a FireEye environment or some other type of sandbox environment. Whereas, through staged restore, through secure restore, we can keep everything contained within the Veeam platform and make sure that we can do all of our tests in one place and make it repeatable and make it scalable.
I'm going to go ahead and give benefit of the doubt and give credit to where credit is due. And that is that for the non-Veeam customers that are listening, when we say things like orchestrations built in, when we say things like, oh, we got a sandbox and we just spin it up and we play with it and validate for backups, or we run it in the sandbox and then we can scan it before we put it back into production again. As someone who's been doing this for more than 3 decades, I understand that's hard. Right? It is hard to create a sandbox that has enough access for the backup solution to drop stuff in. and yet not enough access so it doesn't disrupt the fact that you now have 2 spinning copies of the same production server. And I don't want to break DNS, and I don't want to break Active Directory. It is hard, right? It's one of the reasons why so many years ago we invested in creating a private network and creating that sandbox framework where you don't just drop a VM in. If you really want to test some of this stuff, you got to drop a domain controller in so you can log in, and the backend database, and the middleware, and the front-end web service as a multi-tier app. Now you got 5 VMs that spun up in the sandbox to make sure the app is recoverable and the data within that app is safe, right? And that's hard to do if you're constructing your own sandboxes, right? It's why we put that effort in. So I don't want to diminish the complexity of that. If anything, I just want to laud that's why we do it the way that we do. I don't know another way to do that without having it built into the technology. All right, we got a little bit more. So we talked about secure restore already. We've got kind of one last piece, Chris, we want to kind of bring in, and that's this last one. We've talked about orchestration already, but I can't overemphasize the importance of, if you are, and this is back in regular DR land, right? So not just ransomware. Let's use the ransomware first example, and that is that, Chris, I've heard some horror stories about the bad actor got in, they affected a significant portion of the servers. And while for many of us, mere mortals, we just think, okay, I'm just going to wipe all the drives on the production servers, and then that's going to give me a clean canvas. I'll go ahead and start restoring. I come in on Monday to start those restores, and there's yellow tape around those racks and a federal marshal standing right in front of them. I don't get to use those machines anymore, do I, Chris?
Nope. Been there, done that, lost the hair.
Is that why? Okay.
One of many reasons. So it is entirely possible when law enforcement gets involved that you're going to lose access to not just the rack or the servers that have been affected, but to your entire data center. So being able to have, I'll call it data mobility, being able to restore your data someplace other than the intended target is really important, and being able to understand what the process is for that is critical. Because again, the last place that you want to hear, I don't know, or I think it works like this, is in the middle of a crisis. And, so if, completely outside of Veeam, and somebody made the point that backup is only a part of the solution, they're absolutely right. Having those tabletop exercises, making sure that you're practicing for the catastrophe is really, really important. And one of the things that it's I'll call it a minor feature within the orchestration tool is the ability to automatically build your documentation. For me, as someone who never liked writing documentation,
yes,
that's worth it right there. So that you always know that the process is going to be up to date.
Yeah. So we've got some great questions coming in, some really pragmatic ones coming in. By the way, Adam, props to you on State of Florida for not paying. Yeah. Here's the thing. What I often see is a lot of organizations, even up to the executive level, says we will not pay, right? And then they get hit. And there's the question of, okay, do we follow the rule that we established? Or do we realize that, hey, I'll use public sector as an example. Police department gets affected. Okay, we cannot ingest criminals or release them, right? Hospital gets affected. Cannot actually do patient care. We have life issues now. And I mean, there's all kinds of things that all of a sudden the rule doesn't seem so black and white. And I don't mean to be dismissive of it. I mean, that's just the reality of, until you realize how bad your ability to do your core mission is affected, that can be really, really egregious. There's a couple in here. Charles, I really like your comment on tape. Yes, it's the most air gappable. Are there other things that are better for that? I still like tape, but let me tell you why. I like tape for highly litigated data that has long-term regulatory compliance requirements. So if I have data that I just need to be able to roll back 30, 60, 90 days, I am disk on-prem all day long. If I have data that I want to be able to recover from for fire, flood, earthquake, I want to do that to the cloud for two reasons. One, because cloud's going to be cheaper for me. And two, I already get the secondary data center, right? So back to the comment, Chris, that you're bringing into the fray, if most organizations don't have multi-data center infrastructure. And oh, by the way, even if you do, there's a chance the bad actor affected all of it, especially if it's in the same vCenter scopes of domains. So I love the fact that if I'm going to walk in and my physical servers have yellow tape around them, I can spin up Cloudy Metal and get it back running again. So I love the fact of doing that. Now, for the minority of your data, even in the largest of highly regulated environments, not all data has the same retention mandates, but for the minority percentage of your data, 10, 15%, that has that 20-year, 30-year, 50-year retention rate, love tape for that, right? It's more portable. It lasts longer. You can do more things with it from an e-discovery and chain of custody perspective. So for the minority of data that has that long-term retention, love tape for that. Oh, by the way, it is air gapped as a side benefit. And if you can make it worm, even better. So, but yeah, Charles, totally agree that I would not say tape is my best solution for air gapping across the board. I'd go cloud to that all day long before I ever started. But here's the point coming back to the slide though. And that is that it'd be one thing if my VMs died in Dallas and I brought them back up in Fort Worth. That's where I'm from. See lots of Texas folks on the call today. It's still in my same vCenter environment, same range of IP addresses. It's just going to come right back up again, right? That works for MANs, that works for LANs, that works for WANs within a intranet. If it dies in Dallas and wakes up in a data center that Chris is managing up in Boston, where he's at, IP ranges have to change a little bit. Production infrastructure depends on where the users are coming from. That's okay. If I'm going to spin that to a cloud, there's even more heavy lifting to be done. All that minutia of replumb, especially when the metal change between one source and another, physical to virtual, AMD to Intel, virtual to cloud, all that replumbing, God bless orchestration. That's what that's good for, and the documentation that goes along with it. All right, we got 2 minutes left. We're on our last slide. Hey, Chris, one of the questions on here that I really liked is if you had 30 seconds, what's the one nugget that you would make sure everyone heard? I think that's our best way to close out.
So the one thing from a backup perspective is the 3-2-1 rule, right? Following that will make sure that you've got your data in place. From a more general perspective, I would start looking at the infrastructure and your data hygiene. Right, that's outside of backup. Right, we're talking about your password management. We're talking about segmentation. We're talking about multi-factor authentication. That type of deficit is what has been attributed in almost every single ransomware attack over the past 10 years. So there's four things that you can look at that will help you survive an attack.
I'll throw mine out in 15 seconds or less. Orchestration. Orchestrate test validation of your backups. Orchestrate the steps necessary to rehome. Orchestrate the documentation that's there. Get rid of the humans. Humans are not good at manual repetitive tasks. Orchestrate the heck out of every part of your backup solution. With that, let's turn it back over to the host. Thank you for staying with us for the whole hour. I hope you got what you needed. We're going to try to cover as many questions as we can off thread afterwards, and I'm sure our host will hold us accountable to that.
Yeah, and Jason and Chris, that was a fantastic discussion. Great data, great analysis, great stories. Scott Shelton chimed in the question. He wants to give you guys the Amazon gift cards for such a great webinar. Unfortunately for you, you're not eligible. So, but thank you so much for being here. Really appreciate it.
Thanks.
All right. Well, we will go to people who are eligible for the prize. For the Amazon gift card prize drawing, the winner is Dan Sobel from Massachusetts. So congratulations to Dan. We'll be in touch to get you your card. And of course, we'll be selecting best question winner afterward and reaching out to them via email as well. It's going to be a really tough one. We had over 117 comments and questions here today, so we've got a lot to go through. Appreciate all of your questions and your comments. With that, on behalf of the Actual Tech Media team, I do want to thank Veeam for making this event possible. And as always, thank you for attending and for all of your great questions. That concludes today's event. Have a great rest of your day.